Sam Seder, Emma Vigland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Richard Seymour, writer, commentator based in London, author of Disaster Nationalism, The Downfall of Liberal Civilization. Richard, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Let's start first with just, I guess, the most obvious question. Disaster nationalism, what is that, and why is it under your, I guess, your notion that it's sort of a proto-fascism?
Sure. Well, we live in a world which is not short of real disasters. You only have to look at Los Angeles at the moment, for example. Ecological disasters, economic disasters, wars, all that sort of thing. And I've noticed for a few years now, actually go back to the Tea Party movement, that there was an increasing emphasis on the right, the far right, on illusory, imaginary, hallucinated disasters, FEMA death camps, Obama's fake birth certificate, more recently, white genocide, great replacement, and in India, the fantasy of what's called the love jihad, where Muslim males allegedly seduce Hindu girls in order to attack the Hindu fabric of the nation. They're obsessed with imaginary disasters where there is actually a real disaster in front of them. And what I argue is that quite often there's a direct connection between the two. So, for example, you remember the wildfires in Oregon 2020. The most severe in decades, largely exacerbated by climate change. And this compounded a lot of really bad experiences locally over the last few years, from the credit crunch, rising rural poverty, destruction of local news, rising addiction. This is before the fentanyl crisis, alcoholism, suicide rates soaring, all of that stuff happening. And then this comes along. And there are people who think that it's just too weird. It's too much, too many fires. What's causing this? And they decide it's Antifa. They're setting fire. And they had been listening to rumors on YouTube for a long time telling them that there was an Antifa conspiracy. It was going to kill all the white conservative Christians. And they said, they looked at the COVID lockdown and they said, that's liberal tyranny. And they looked at the Black Lives Matter riots and protests, and they said, that's the sedition. They're coming for us. They're burning down the cities. Now they're going to burn us down. And that rumor spread spontaneously. It's an apocalyptic rumor. It didn't require any support. Only after the fact did Donald Trump and local police big it up and spread it across social media networks. That's typical of the kind of process that we see already today. We can see this in the case of Los Angeles, where there are rumors that Mayor Bass cut funding on firefighters, which she did, but in order to spend on diversity and inclusion and so on, which she didn't. I mean, it was a general austerity program. So that's disaster nationalism. It's a way of turning a disaster, which is very difficult to deal with, abstract, remote, climate change, capitalism. You can't shoot these things, but Antifa, you can shoot. And then you can go and shoot at Black Lives Matter and stab them and use vehicular attacks. And then you can go to Congress or the Capitol building and try and string up the communists who you say are in charge. This is a very animating, exciting alternative to the common experience of going through a series of disasters, which is to feel demoralized, bludgeoned, incapable of action, apathetic, and so on. That's disaster nationalism. Why is it incipiently fascist? I simply want to say that clearly there are elements that are similar to the traditional experience of fascism. The racial violence, the yearning, the hungering for a dictatorship. You remember the QAnon fantasy was a storm, a day of reckoning. And they were going to round up all the leftists and the liberals and the Hollywood celebrities and the Democrats, put them in Guantanamo, have shootings, etc. It's a fascist fantasy. What they don't have yet is the kind of political or ideological maturity to realize any of these objectives. They tried the January 6th insurrection. They tried a pseudo-insurrection in Brazil when Bolsonaro was defeated. There was the Reichsbürger plot in Germany. They don't have paramilitary movements. They don't have organized parties, except in India. India is a unique case. The violence that we see is largely networked, it's decentralized, and it happens stochastically. You'll get years of incitement and then something will blow up. A bit like the pogroms that we had in the UK over the summer. So I would say that there are elements of fascism congealing, forming, and these fascist elements are in coalition with the more traditional hard right.
Wait, before we get to the why on this, and I also actually want to go back to see, if we hadn't had elements of this in the States anyways, in the, in the context of like the John Birch Society and whatnot, but just to also give an example of this dynamic, and the international, from our perspective, quality of it, and I may be mispronouncing this because I read it in your work, but the Gujarat fire and sort of subsequent like riots afterwards, like how does that provide another example or a template for this dynamic?
Yeah, I think it's the canary in the coal mine there, because what happened was that in the northern Indian state of Gujarat, the BJP, which is a hard right Hindu nationalist party, was in charge. And they were in trouble. They were going to lose the elections. They were plummeting in the polls. There had been an earthquake, a real disaster, the year before this fire on the train. The fire that happened on the train turns out to have been an accident, according to independent investigations. But local BJP leaders, activists, businessmen, and so on said, no, this was an attack by Muslims. They did this. They wanted to kill the Hindus on that train. This is genocide, and we're going to get them for it. So they organized a pogrom. And this is not unknown in India. There's been decades in which pogroms have often been used, communal violence, in order to rally a right-wing Hindu vote. But they went way further than ever before in this case, killing thousands of Muslims, cutting them to pieces, fire, acid, every enormity that you can think of, rape, murdering infants, everything, they did it. They had an ecstatic, carnivalesque few days of non-stop brutality. And then after that, the result was that the BJP's vote went up by 5%, and it went up most in those areas that the violence had been worse. So this was one of the early examples of recent far-right history where they were able to show that collective violence is not an embarrassment, it's not an electoral problem, it's part of the sell, it's a unique selling point. It excites them, it animates them. Narendra Modi, who's now the Prime Minister of India, at the time he was the governor of the state of Gujarat, was going around the state doing Hindu pride rallies. And he was described by observers as having become a sex symbol. That was the kind of magnetism that he had because of this violence. So already you see elements of the kind of the ethno-nationalist violence, that's its relationship to electoral success, the decentralized way of doing violence, although there were quite centralized apparatuses at work, a lot of it was spontaneous. And then also the erotic fantasies. Quite a lot of today's far right, MRAs, incels, fantasies about child trafficking by the Democrats and Hollywood and all that sort of stuff. It's immersed in fantasies of extreme sexual evil, and against which, of course, they are armed. So this is one of the first examples where disaster nationalism, as I'm calling it, gives you something to take arms against, which, again, it's very exciting, but it doesn't solve anything because, like any symptom, it exists to avoid the solution.
How is this are we in your mind a new era of this? Has these eras happened before? Like the Reichstag fire sounds, sort of similar in some, at least in terms of this dynamic. This happens, we're going to blame it on the communists, and it gives us an excuse to sort of crack down. Maybe not the idea of pogroms. Certainly, we had that type of dynamic. In terms of the indigenous people in this country, like I say, the John Birch Society has trafficked in QAnon-like conspiracies 70 years ago. When you say that are we in just simply a new era of this sort of like cycling around? And why is this happening? In why is this era happening now, and why is it international?
So I would say a couple of things about that. First of all, I think there's always fascist elements in a democratic society, and in the United States in particular. I mean, I did my PhD thesis on anti-communism in the South during the civil rights movement, and there was elements of fascist organizing there for sure. You had these institutions called state sovereignty councils, which were like petty dictatorships. They could get anyone banned, anyone barred, and they basically worked in conjunction with white citizens' councils and the clans and so on. So there's an incipient fascist network being formed there around the theme of anti-communism. The civil rights people are all communists. That's always been there, or versions of that have always been there. And I think, personally, I think as long as we live in a capitalist society, that's going to be a potential. There are massive differences, though, and I think this is really important. First of all, today's so-called disaster nationalism is not trying to overthrow democracy yet. It's an anti-liberal movement for sure, and it seeks to tilt the balance, constitutionally in favor of much more authoritarianism. But you haven't seen them try to crush democratic institutions. Rather, they claim to speak up for a very ethnically exclusionary, majoritarian version of democracy. So that's what they're trying to do. Second thing is they. As I said, they don't have the organization. Classical fascism emerged from thick civic society organization. Even, the American example I gave, I talked about white citizens councils, clans, and so on. You don't really have that today. In America, you have some militias, but really a lot of it is anomic. This is why you get lone wolf murderers, because there's a lack of organization on their side. And in fact, a lack of social behavior more generally. That's a trend that's been happening in America. I think India is a big exception, where you do have something like a matured fascism coming into being, because you've got these civil society organizations like the RSS and so on, which and paramilitaries, which do have deep roots in the society. But I think most of what we're seeing today is very isolated, and it's not very utopian. That's another distinction. Historically, fascism promised a kind of utopia. It claimed to be anti-capitalist. It claimed that it would do something radically new and different, and that was rooted in the colonial perspective. We're going to take some land, and we're going to turn it over to you and your family and your kids, and you're going to have a great existence. And there will be people there, say tens of millions of Russians, to be slaves for you. And your world would be a lot better. That was the utopian perspective. Doesn't have anything like that today. Today, it's a very defensive, white nationalist, bordered worldview. I shouldn't say white nationalist, because globally that doesn't really play. Right. But it's very defensive, nationalist, bordered, and it's much more predicated on the organization and harnessing of aggression. Your life is not going to get much better, but you are going to get the chance to destroy a neighbor. And then one other difference, I mentioned anti-capitalism and so on. Today's far right is very vigorously pro-capitalist. They have internalized a lot of the ideas of what we call neoliberalism for the last 40 years. A lot of these far-right movements are quite explicitly, overtly associated with the ideas of Hayek. And in fact, Quinn Slobodian's got a book on that coming out, which is, he's done the research on this. It's very insightful. So this is a very novel kind of phenomenon. And I really think if fascism does mature, and we do see a mature fascist threat, it will not look like a dress rehearsal of the 1920s and 1930s. We should look for differences.
Interesting.
And I just have a quick question about the nationalism piece, if you don't mind expanding on this. Just the idea that nationalism, for the most part, is a bad thing. But in say like anti-colonial movements, right? Nationalism has been deployed to kick out the colonizers, and that has a positive effect overall. But mostly what seems to characterize this version of nationalism as ethnic nationalism. And there is the utopian element of an imagined past and like make America great again, but it's one of ethnic purity, and it's mostly second or third order to crypto, take the chains off, scam as many people as you want, and grab what you can in this current moment, and it's on the backs of this group of people. Would it be fair to characterize it as ethnic in its core identity and not necessarily around a national identity in the ways that perhaps previous fascist movements did?
See, that really depends. I think traditionally fascism has been ethnic in its orientation, or racial. I think if you listen to someone like Steve Bannon, he will claim it's got nothing to do with race, ethnicity. I stand up for African-American workers.
He just came out against Musk and Thiel and Slack as being South African racists, which, a broken clock is right twice a day. But
when he's right, he's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it does feel like posturing, more like a political posturing. He seems to be wielding that in a more like politically expedient way today. I think he just feels like he's on the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, I mean, I don't take him very seriously on this, but I do think that there are contradictions in today's far right on this axis of whether it's ethnicity or something else. I also think it's really important to say, you're quite right that nationalism, there's no fixed meaning to nationalism. I mean, I give a thumbnail a sort of sketch of the history of nationalism in which I'm very negative about it. But historically, there have been nationalisms which have been articulated in a progressive, radical, egalitarian way. Irish nationalism, Palestinian nationalism, for example. There are two things that I would say about that, though. One is that historically, the most radical parts of those movements have sought to go beyond nationalism because they've always seen it as a kind of a trap. Like, for example, Indian radical post-colonial thinkers were very skeptical of Indian nationalism on the grounds that it basically articulated the prerogatives and perspectives of the Indian middle class and the incipient bourgeoisie rather than the majority. But also there was a critique, and I think thinkers like Paul Gilroy would make this point, that there's no hard barrier between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. And there's always a sense in which Michael Mann talks about this in his book on the dark side of democracy, where the demos can become the ethnos through a kind of distortion. So in moments of crisis, in moments of turmoil, people can become fixated with an ethnic idea of the nation state. So I agree we have to make those distinctions, only that I would add that they kind of break down at certain points. And also, some of the most progressive forms of like cultural nationalism, take, for example, negritude, Aimé Césaire. This, was a rebellious anti-colonial doctrine, but then it was also the official doctrine of the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti. So I think we have to be wary of nationalism and its juxtaposition to the metaphysics of race.
All right, I just want to get back to the for a moment of like why now, because and how that matches up. You talk about the falling middle, and the sort of like at least in the context of this country, and I don't know how that sort of like analogizes with what's going on in India, for instance, because it sort of feels like it maybe headed in different directions. But, one of the things that we heard about Trump in 2016 was this about economic anxiety, and as opposed to economic deprivation, right? Like the difference between being, I'm upper middle class and I am not sure of my material status, or maybe I'm sure of my material status, but I'm not sure of my social status. Just talk about that sort of whole, I guess, sort of it's amorphous on some level, the interplay between those things. But what role is that playing in this unique era?
Okay, so what I was able to find out, and this more or less applies across countries. It's not the particularly poor or left behind who are most likely to gravitate to this kind of resentful nationalism. The evidence suggests that it's people who've experienced a relative decline, a trajectory of class decline over some years. And, you know, we saw that with the so-called insurrection in DC, where a lot of the participants were people who'd been very rich. They'd done very well out of the boom years. And then since the credit crunch had been experiencing crisis after crisis, many of them going bankrupt and what have you. I certainly think that's the case with the established middle class in Brazil that rallied behind Bolsonaro and to some extent in the Philippines. So there is, it's not so much about whether you're deprived, you could be working class, middle class, whatever. It's, do you feel threatened? And, you know, this is not, there's no hard line here between, I know in America there's the debate over economic versus status anxiety. I pick examples from across the world to show that that's a kind of, to be honest, it's a kind of parochial debate. That division doesn't really play out. They're both part of the same thing. And
by saying they're both part of the same thing, is that it's whether it's material or status is not relevant, or is it that they are often sort of intertwined in some fashion?
They are intertwined and co-constitutive, like they produce one another. So, for example, take racism in America. You know, that's what's usually meant by status anxiety. That is obviously a class phenomenon. It's not only a class phenomenon, but it is, you know, if you want to look at who gets the worst jobs, who gets to shove to the bottom of every available pile, and who experiences the worst of class life, you know, it's going to be African Americans, right? And that's true in most countries. You know, somebody is going to be at the bottom of the pile, and usually they'll be racialized, but their experience will also be a class experience. So they're part of the same thing. So yeah, I think that the motives behind this have to do with the emotionally toxic consequences of failure and loss. Failure is really toxic in this day and age because we've had 40 years of neoliberalism in which we've been told if something goes wrong, basically you didn't handle your capital well in the marketplace. And what's more, you know, the slope of inequality has become a lot steeper. So you've got a lot farther to fall. And then there's this culture of sadism. So we emulate winners. You know, Donald Trump was a big winner for years. He was on The Apprentice. The libidinal high of his show was when he pointed at someone and said, "You're fired." And we're supposed to emulate that and worship that and admire that. But at the same time, culturally, there was a lot of scorn for people who lived on benefits, who had failed to, you know, I mean, nobody wanted to be that person. And so if you put people in a situation where suddenly you might be part of ordinary, toiling, struggling humanity, and whatever distinction you've crafted for yourself in this world will be taken away from you, that's when you become dangerous. Now that, you know, that can lend itself to radical left-wing politics in some circumstances. But, you know, historically, if you look at groups like, for example, the middle class in Germany around 1930, their terror was of joining the working class, who at that time were very poor. They didn't want to have anything to do with that. So I think the fear of being, of plunging into the abyss, of losing distinction is a big part of this. And just one last thing on that, you know, this is another way in which economic and status anxiety are part of the same thing. You find a similar pattern with the fear of desegregation and the fear of gender norms being eroded. There's the idea that being, you know, the richness of being is best defended by a heavily structured hierarchy in which everybody knows his place and everybody has his place. And if people start, you know, crossing racial, gender, and class lines, then that's regarded or experienced as an impoverishment.
So, if I understand you correctly, the economic anxiety essentially is very quickly, that itch is scratched by essentially going into a status anxiety, which ends up sort of addressing that itch on some level without it really threatening the economic hierarchy.
It doesn't, yeah, exactly. It gives you a chance to restore your honor, your pride, as it were. Pride is a big word. Hindu pride, the Proud Boys, it comes up again and again. It gives you a chance to address your shamefulness and your experienced weakness by destroying a neighbor. And I think that's a big part of the sort of psychodynamics of what we're seeing in Gaza right now, where you've got 20-something-year-old men who are having a great time, apparently, according to their social media feeds, expunging the shame, the felt weakness from 7th of October. So, this is...
speak of that. Yeah. I mean, because you're talking specifically, too, in about, like, where you have, like, these images of both in terms of what we've seen out of Israeli soldiers going in there and proudly,
wearing the lingerie.
Proudly blowing up universities and then parading around in lingerie and, just children's toys and whatnot. Like, that is a way of just sort of like busting through the shame. Is that the theory? I mean, like, I mean, it's sort of classic overcompensation, I guess.
Seems to be, yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I've been working on something about perpetrators, and I ended up looking into the material on Sierra Leone, Cambodia, where there have been these atrocities. And quite often what you find, I mean, there are all sorts of motivations, but one of them is that you get people who've been injured or damaged by society in some way, been made to feel weak. This is quite common with violent criminals too. And they expunge that by carrying out atrocities. But the paradox is that the more you kill, the more you're obliged to kill, because once you've tortured somebody or whatever, that in itself is shameful. Everybody knows this. Unless you've been raised in a completely different culture where these sorts of things aren't shameful, that stigma attaches itself to you. And the only way to manage that is to continue to kill. So, I mean, I don't ascribe, causal primacy to psychological motives. I do think we have to look at history and economics and so on. But I think, economic and political and historical forces ultimately work on us through our emotions and through our mental states, and we act on that basis. So, I mean, if the argument was, we have an economic crisis, recession, and that's turned people to the right. The question would be, why don't they turn to the left? Why don't they seek redistribution? Why don't they try and expropriate the expropriators, as they used to say? That would be a logical, rational thing to do. And in order to, understand that, you have to try and grapple with the raw emotions that we're all afflicted with every day.
Is it just an emotional turn at that moment when they're which I guess populist movement am I going to subscribe to in that moment? Is it just psychological, or also are there structural reasons? Because there's a strong incentive structure for the capitalist class to have people go one way versus the other way. Absolutely.
And look, for decades, the left has been defeated and hammered. The labor movement has been defeated and hammered. We've got an incipient sort of revival in recent years, but still fairly weak and fraught. So where are the opportunities to organize coming from? On the other hand, whose voices are you hearing? When you look at the mainstream media, they seem to, I think, in general, give much more salience and credibility to the concerns of the far right than the radical left. So there's that kind of incentive. But I think also fundamentally, it's partly also down to the destruction of our information ecologies, because behaving radically means getting to the root of things. It means thinking things through systematically and critically, and we don't really have much space for critical thought. We're bombarded and bludgeoned with ideas, very emotionally potent ideas, which we're never given the space to think through critically. And I think about this in terms of like social media. I spent way too much time on Twitter. You're bombarded with ideas, which in that format, there's no real space to think through critically. What does this mean? And not just, think through whatever ideas contained in a short tweet, but to think through the context, the historical situation, etc. There's so much information that's missing. And so you end up being bludgeoned into a kind of passive consent. But what's worse is that by retweeting, by sharing, by quote tweeting and so on, you feel like you have some sort of agency, when all that's happened is that you've agreed to become a relay for an idea that you haven't really thought about properly. So I think that's part of the situation we're in. So yeah, I agree. There's structural reasons, there's historical reasons, there's economic reasons. One thing that's worth bearing in mind, there are certain types of people in this world who are not very susceptible to the far right's message. One of them is people who are in trade unions. That's a useful thing to know. Another is people who are at the very bottom, people who are, whether they're racialized or whether they're the lowest end of the working class, they're the least interested. That's also useful to know. And also there seems to be a correlation with education. So people going through the higher education system, despite everything that's wrong with the higher education system, seem to come up with some sort of inoculation against those ideas. I know that's more complicated in America because you do have some graduates for Trump, but I'm talking general patterns here.
Well, why is that? I can understand trade unionists. I think, although we have unionists in this country that I think are still sort of like attracted to the sort of the rights call. But why is it? As a college grad, I like to flatter myself by thinking like, okay, that's why I understand why maybe graduates are inoculated. But why would trade unionists and folks at the lowest income spectrum be inoculated in some way? And that doesn't necessarily mean that they see the threat per se, right? It's just that they're not necessarily as enticed by what this disaster nationalism offers.
Sure. So the evidence from Europe, for example, is that the unions, it really depends on how the union is organized, its prevailing ethos, and how effective it is. So unions are much less effective at inoculating people against fascism or far-right politics, racist politics, and so on, when they find that if they have been unable to prevent precarity, if they've been unable to prevent flexibilization, if you've got some groups of workers who are better off than others, then those groups of workers who are slightly better off will be minded to see themselves as having a common cause with the bosses, and will be much more frightened by and threatened by what they regard as spongers, people encroaching on this little island of wealth. So there's no guarantees with the unions, but if the unions still represent something like a social movement and a cause, then I think it's that sense of solidarity, being in it together, and having a political purpose that is antagonistic to capitalism, that is solidaristic and egalitarian, that kind of works against fascist penetration. So that's one of the factors. In terms of the poor, the people at the very bottom,
it's the other side of that dynamic. They don't have the anxiety of dropping lower on some level, or that somebody's coming to get what is theirs.
Yeah, and also I think that there's research showing that people are more likely to give money to charity or give money to the homeless if they're at the very bottom end of the income spectrum. I mean, I think in a way, not being incorporated into capitalism and its regular structures kind of means that your ordinary, I guess what some might call your baseline communism, your ordinary impulses towards human solidarity have not been overridden. So I think there's an element of that.
You're more connected to your humanity. You're more connected to, and perhaps the cheap politics of domination are less appealing to you in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I don't want to romanticize any group of people like, salt of the earth. There certainly are people in that group who can be drawn to far-right politics. And having grown up in Northern Ireland in Protestant communities, I've met some of these people. The kinds of people who join loyalist death squads and what have you. But yeah, I mean, in general, there's a kind of resistance to it. And it's worth knowing that that's the case. I would have said until fairly recently that I would have thought the very rich would have too much, rationality in terms of their long-term interests to want to believe in this kind of politics. They might use it instrumentally. And I think in fairness, the American bourgeoisie, capitalist class, whatever we call it, has rallied very hard behind the Democrats. In terms that's where the money is going. They didn't particularly want Trump in, but you do see sectors of big capital now, not just the outliers, but Silicon Valley now sort of gravitating towards Trump. I think we've seen elements of that take place in India, Hungary, other places where the far right have gained power.
I want to just get briefly to the antidote, but I do want to touch on your inclusion of a chapter in what's happening in Gaza. Like how, from a contextualize that for us. Like why these are ideas obviously that you've been thinking about, I would imagine, for some time, but why did what's going on in Gaza, this slaughter there, genocide, different people can use different words for it, but how does that fit in this context?
When I was started writing the book, I thought Israel would be a bit player. I could talk about the pogroms in the West Bank. I could talk a little bit about the history of Zionism and its ethno-nationalist politics, actually. But I didn't think I'd be talking much about it. But then, of course, the genocide began on the 8th of October, and it was loudly and brashly announced. This is what we're going to do. We're going after human animals. It's a myth that there are any civilians in there who didn't know, that kind of thing. Nobody is innocent. We need to use nuclear weapons. Actually, I mean, the rhetoric is even more extreme whenever I looked into it than I had thought. And across the board, from politicians, journalists, rabbis, military leaders, genocidal incitement and exhortation everywhere. So I couldn't not include this. I knew that there were certain factors about Israel that make it unique and distinctive. As a settler colonial project, it has certain dynamics that don't apply if you're in Hungary or Italy, for example. So, a lot of people, when they look at the Israeli far right, would say, well, we can track it back to, for example, the 1967 war, the triumphalism emerging from that, the new territory, and the messianic settler movement. But actually, I looked at it and I thought there are aspects of this too that are very similar to what we've seen elsewhere. One of them is that you have the downfall of a post-war kind of national social democratic utopia, bought in Israel's case on the back of the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of 1948. And you have the rise of a new right, which is anti-union, anti-labor, anti-socialist, blames socialism for economic failures. You have the economic crisis of the 1970s. You have a drastic shift towards neoliberalism coming off the back of that. And you have increasing inequality. The Labour Party, we talked about, maybe not, we haven't talked in this context about social democracy, but that's one of the bigger factors, is the decline of social democracy. Social democratic parties like Labour in the UK, SDP in Germany, Socialist Party in France, and so on, their decline has created the space in which this neo-far right politics can grow. In Israel, Labour barely exists anymore, having dominated the scene in the post-war period. They've been absolutely, their last hurrah was the Oslo process, and for various reasons that was scuppered, that's gone. So I think that you can look at these patterns of a right-wing trajectory, an increasingly unequal society, the pathologies of neoliberalism, and actually increasingly pessimistic society, a society where the majority don't really believe the future is going to be any better for their children than it was for them or their parents. I see that in Britain. I think we see that in France. We see it, increasingly particularly across Euro America. So that deep pessimism and sense of despair fuels and feeds into ethnic nationalism, particularly where there isn't a serious, organized alternative.
I mean, even I guess the irony is, I mean, at least in the context of this country, this notion of a climate catastrophe, aside from the one we just witnessed, the massive one we just witnessed in LA, but just sort of like the broad idea of it is creates the anxiety even amongst those of part of the party that deny its reality. And I guess that's broadly the theme of what you're writing here is these illusions that supplant real anxieties or that cover up real anxieties so that the solutions provided no way infringe upon those generally capitalist entities that are creating these anxieties. Job loss, insecurity, the commodification of necessities of life, the commodification of the health of the planet, et cetera, et cetera. So what is to the extent that there is one, what is the antidote?
Okay, so you were just talking about, the way in which people respond to job losses, ecological crisis, and so on. Quite often, I would say, with a feeling of being overwhelmed, apathetic, unable to do anything about it. There's a pretty good book by René Lertzman, who is an environmental psychoanalyst, who basically found in our fieldwork that lots of people who express apathy when you first talk to them, it turns out that they're carrying around an unprocessed mourning for ecological destruction. They recognize it, they register it, they don't want to deal with it. And so they say, I don't care about that. What changes this kind of frozen state of melancholia into something more productive? I think, frankly, the starting point is getting together and finding a common interest. And that can, Marxists have long talked about this dialectic where you begin by organizing around something like an immediate material interest, like your wages or your house price, rent, whatever. And by working together, you find gradually that you have a need for one another. And that's a radical need, the need for community. And you often find historically that when unions went on strike, they did so despite losing income. They were striking to defend their union, and that mattered more. Marx made fun of the economists, the English economists who didn't understand this. And the most radical need, I think, that Marx identified, the one that can come into existence through this process, is the need for universality. You come out, having defended yourself, having fought for your own interests, having found a power in community, thinking, I don't want anyone to go through this. I don't want anyone to suffer this kind of injustice or any kind of injustice. And I belong to the whole human race. For me, I have experienced forms of solidarity in my life in political parties and, what have you. I volunteer at a local church, and every week people go down and work to help refugees, and they bring stuff that they've made, give up their free time. They don't have to do it. Nobody's forcing them to do it. But the point is that in that context, it's much easier to believe in a society based on equality and justice. If your daily life is basically capitalism and nothing but capitalism, which is basically nothing but competition, nothing but everybody around you as a competitor, an enemy, they could stick the knife in, you can't trust anyone, and also a world that doesn't really make any sense because we're not giving the information to make it make sense. If that's all you've got, then it's very hard to believe in alternatives. And no wonder you turn to vengeance. No wonder you turn to what really is impotent lashing out. Demonstrations of omnipotence that amount to nothing but bloodshed. But if you have experienced the chance to be effectual, and I think that's one of the big problems, people do not feel effectual. They don't feel they have any sense of agency. Look at those MRAs and incels. When Trump was elected, they started saying things like, your body, my choice forever. Right. They're saying this to women, right? This pathetic display I think, is typical of the kind of men's rights activists grappling after some sense of their own power and agency in the deluded form of misogyny. And they're very dangerous. Just calling them delusional doesn't mean that they won't actually act on this and so on. But the point is, I think a lot of people feel this paralysis in their lives, and they're right to feel it because the system is set up to shut you out and stop you from organizing. So I think we need to feel a sense of empowerment by organizing together, and we need to have wins. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be a major win, but we need to experience a victory, because the kind of constant message of the system is there's no alternative, you can't do anything for yourself, and they need you not to be able to experience your own potential power. So that would be the alternative, I would say.
What does that look like in sort of like in concrete terms? And I should say, like, the guy who specifically, was pushing that your body, my choice. It's his audience that we're talking to. He's got his own, I think, very specific battles that he's fighting in his mind about his sexuality, and this I think is a head fake, if you were. But the audience that might be receptive to that, those are the people that, to the extent that there's an opportunity to, at the very least, peel off some of that cohort and put them in a different direction. But what does that look like concretely? Like, how, like, when you say organize, like, what does that mean for in the daily life of people and get a win?
Absolutely. So in terms of organizing, I think on the left, people tend to talk about it as if it means like spreadsheets and phone calls and all the rest of it. I think of organizing, I think of the Bernie Sanders campaign, for example. I think in the UK of the Corbyn experience, it wasn't just about signing up as a member of a party or whatever. It was about the kind of exuberant passion that led to people packing meeting halls and vibrantly debating political ideas and feeling a sense that they could actually do something. It was about people knocking doors, and trying to change the future of the country. Bernie Sanders, what was his big sort of phrase he kept repeating? If we stand together. And, it could sound like a cliche, but coming from him, it wasn't a cliche because he meant it. He was inviting people into the improbable adventure of getting together to change the country fundamentally. And I think what we're missing, well, obviously we need a lot of things that we don't have. I think we need a much stronger labor movement for sure, but I don't think that's going to be enough. I think we need some sort of expression at the national political level. In the UK, I know that we're missing a party of the radical left. I think that's what manifestly is required. There are hundreds of thousands of people who recently were members of the Labour Party because they supported Jeremy Corbyn. They wanted to do something about it, and now they're not members of anything. And they haven't changed their mind. It's not that they don't have the politics. Give people a way to federate their will effectively, to pull it together, and also by creating a party, one also creates a very important node of communication. Parties in the kind of ecosphere of political organizing are great generalists. They connect up with one single issue campaigns, with environmental campaigns, whatever. So that would be.
But what is it? What's a version of that is bottom up? I mean, because I can't will another Bernie Sanders figure as much as I would like to, and that's not incumbent upon me. And as opposed to the idea of waiting for that figure, as sitting in my home wherever I am across the country or anywhere else. What can I do in a concrete fashion that begins to sort of like do this thing? Like if I don't have a campaign that somebody else is waging it to join, how do I how do we generate that type of organization or do that organization, I guess?
Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of what a party is for, so that when you don't have the charismatic leader, you have a machinery that is also a memory, and that connects people who can be involved in this or that campaign. So I know, for example, in Los Angeles, the Democratic Socialists of America have been campaigning on housing and rent controls for a long, long time. And they don't, like they struggle with it because it's very difficult to achieve any political change. But the point is, you're meeting people, you're talking to people on the doorstep, and you're setting certain thresholds for relative success. Okay, so you want to achieve something, even if you can't achieve the main goal, you can achieve something interim. You can talk to so many people, and frankly, a lot of the work that's involved in organizing, I found the wins tend to come. They tend to come cumulatively later on down the line. So, for example, we had the Stop the War movement in the UK, biggest social movement we ever had. The wins from that, we didn't stop the Iraq War.
Right.
The wins were experienced 10 years later when they refused to vote to go and bomb Syria, and when it became controversial to support a British involvement in a war, and it changed the culture fundamentally. So I think to some extent it's about building up, organizational capacity and preparation for moments of crisis, opportunity, whatever. Partly it's about applying pressure that you're going to see the results of it further down the line. But also, I kind of hear what you're saying. I think also we need jam today. We need some wins today. It seems obvious that the kinds of campaigns that are most likely to get wins today, even though it's incredibly difficult, are the campaigns that are happening around the trade unions in America, like in Amazon and so on. And we have some of that happening here in the UK too. I think that, but it might also be a rent strike campaign. It might be a campaign over the privatization of a local utility or something like that. I don't want to be too prescriptive because I think what's important is that people get a sense of the fact that they have some collective power. And also, really importantly, that they have a sense of historical belonging and historical memory, because otherwise we're floating around, we have no reference, we keep repeating the wheel, reinventing the wheel, keep trying to do things that have already been done much more effectively, or forgetting lessons from past situations that we should be remembering now. So I think that's another sort of benefit from being in an organization. You can get a much larger sense of your life and your person and the dilemmas that you go through. Otherwise, you're thrashing about impotently with no understanding of what's happening to you. I've talked about the disasters that happen in people's lives. If you have no means of analyzing, why is this happening to me? Talk about the incels. Why am I lonely? Why does nobody want to talk to me? Well, there may be reasons for that have to do with their particular personalities or behavior or whatever. Maybe they're angry, misogyny is putting people off, etc. But let's say that that's a symptom of a deeper problem, which is that social life is becoming a lot more lonely, a lot more isolated over the years. It would be useful to be able to understand that in terms of the way in which our social life is being commodified. For example, by the social industry, social media platforms, that kind of thing, and the ways in which dating life is being commodified and turning it into like a horrible experience. And we're being denied the kind of ordinary life skills that we used to have to develop, with the help of friends, parents, and what have you. We're being denied that. It's being black boxed, and instead we're being encouraged to rely on these technologies. And no wonder we're clueless. So I think, an organization where people can thrash out these things and learn about themselves and their history, give you a sense of empowerment much better than anything you get from Andrew Tate fandom.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the wake of the financial crisis, I remember interviewing Jessica Bruder, who had written Nomad Land, which was basically an ethnography of people who had lost their homes in the financial crisis. And her hearing time after time that each person thought it was their own individual sort of like shortcomings that led them into this situation, even though there were millions of people that they were seeing around in their same situation. And the idea that we are,
Yeah.
I think people understand it in the context of sort of like capitalist vocabulary, but the idea of like networking, when people network, it's not because they think they're going to get a job tomorrow from the networking, but they're building a network. And on some level, we need to do the same thing for social movements. Richard Seymour, writer and commentator, author of Disaster Nationalism, The Downfall of Liberal Civilization. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and in our podcast and YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.